It's time for another video that has been a long time coming. So follow me on a journey to discover a tale of passion, struggle, and serious confidence. In the 90s, video game development was practically non-existent in Croatia, but there existed a small team with big dreams. After working on a handful of games for Amiga computers, Croteam was inspired by the likes of id Software and 3D Realms to create something of their own. In 1996, they began working on Escape 3D, an engine that would power a game called In the Flesh. It was supposed to be a multiplayer shooter with state-of-the-art technology, and Croteam was very proud of it. But sometime in 1998, the CEO had a strange dream, and the project went in a different direction. Croteam went full bananas ahead with a first-person shooter starring a tough-as-nails action hero going on a journey through various places and epochs. Escape 3D became Serious Engine, and In the Flesh became Serious Sam. Sometime in the last few years, an old alpha version of Serious Sam was leaked to the public, and we sure as balls are taking a look at it, because it will come up again later. A lot of what you see here was revamped or simply doesn't exist in the final games. You still visit places like Egypt and Babylon, but the finished games have a lot more visual splendor. Everything in the alpha is unfinished, unpolished, and unloved. Still, I like how colorful it is, even if it's glitching out because of compatibility issues, I guess. The level selection also indicates that Sam was supposed to go to planet Sirius at one point, to discover the ancient civilization that basically explains a lot of the plot-related technobabble. They look different, but most weapons are already present, and 3 of them were cut from the final games. It's the same story with the enemies. Some got reworked, and some just didn't see the light of day. The beheaded soldiers, queers and arachnoids have the same attacks but different designs. Instead of the electrofish, you have these fishmen, which make the same sound but move differently. Nars could transform between land and air forms, whereas in the final versions the 2 forms are separate enemies. But none of this would matter if it was released in this state. There's something screwed up about the mouse controls, making them sticky and imprecise. This can be alleviated by changing Windows's own mouse settings, but it's still kind of awful. As you would expect from a development build, it needs polish. The weapons lack impact since some enemies don't react to getting hit, and some of the level design is just bland and lifeless. But the potential was always there. Croteam could have just polished it up a little and it wouldn't be a bad game. It certainly looks like Serious Sam, just more chunky. But it wouldn't be the Serious Sam that I know and love, since it doesn't have the same tone as the final games. And you don't need to play this alpha version since the alpha remake mod lets you do it with the bonuses that come with playing the finished game, like widescreen resolutions, mouse aiming that doesn't suck, and menus that are just a tad less ugly. If you're interested in the alpha, do check it out. Anyway, progress was coming along, and the game looked seriously nice. Or at least Croteam thought it did. They proposed the deal to 30 different publishers, and not even one was interested. The story also goes that Croteam couldn't afford tons of hardware to test the game, so they released a test demo to the public to gather info on how it ran on different setups. This demo was a massive hit, and Croteam got the attention of God. You know, gathering of developers? They struck a publishing deal, and with the financial aid and the guiding hand of God, Croteam was on its way to success. Serious Sam: The First Encounter got its initial release in March of 2001 as a budget title. A year later, the second encounter was released. While they are technically separate games, both play the same and share assets like enemies and weapons, so you can take them as 2 parts of one package. The first encounter begins with some scrolling text explaining that mankind discovered traces of an ancient civilization, the Syrians, and their advanced technology leads humanity to outer space. However, an entity known as Mental summons monsters from other dimensions, and mankind faces annihilation. But as Earth struggles to survive, Sam's Sirius Stone becomes a symbol of hope against Mental's hordes. Humankind's last chance is a Syrian artifact called the Time Lock, which has the power to send a single person back in time. Only one man would be fit for this mission. The scene shifts to Sam's clumsy arrival at ancient Egypt, where his adventure starts as he searches for the 4 elements to open a path to Thebes. But of course, Mental sends his bitch boys to hunt for Sam. The second encounter picks up after first encounter's ending, where Sam commandeers a giant frisbee. But things go wrong quickly as a crate bus piloted by Croteam's staff members crashes into it and falls down to South America. So once again, Sam has to fight his way past Mental's hordes. The story is mostly just an excuse to shoot baddies, so you might be surprised to learn that it's actually rich in details and even educational at times. This is all thanks to the AI implanted into Sam's head, called Netrixa, or Nettie to her friends. Netrixa regularly gets updated with information about places, weapons and enemies. It tells you where you are and even teaches you a bit of history. It explains why your revolvers have infinite ammo, and it tells you why you're being chased by living boners. And all of it is completely optional fluff, which is the best kind of fluff. If you just want to shoot aliens, that's fine, but there was so much love and care put into these entries, and it seriously helps bring this weird and quirky alternate universe to life. In turn, that makes the player more invested in the gameplay, which at its core is bog standard. You run, you shoot, you jump, you pick up items, you push buttons, and yeah, the levels are usually split into separate arenas where the game spawns a bunch of enemies and then you move to another. But you know you're in for something special when the difficulty selection needs an explanation. Serious Sam has 5 difficulties by default. Rather than only adjusting damage, each difficulty changes multiple things, such as health and ammo and the number and behavior of enemies. For example, Tourist automatically regenerates your health up to 200. Normal, which is what I'm playing, cuts back the health, armor and ammo maximums from Tourist and Easy. Hard increases enemy speed and numbers, and Serious increases them further, while giving you back the bigger ammo maximums. An unusual but pretty nifty thing is the crosshair. There's a few different designs to choose from, but more importantly it changes color based on how much health the enemy has. It also does this weird scaling based on where you're aiming at, which I think is cool, but some people might prefer it disabled. Now let's talk weapons. Usually I give a rundown of the arsenal, but there isn't much to say about most of them. The first encounter starts you off with a knife for close range, and a revolver that is accurate but deals low damage and has to reload every 6 shots. Picking up another lets you dual wield them. You have both a single-barreled shotgun that deals less damage but is a bit faster and more accurate, and a double-barreled shotgun that is slower but deals more damage. You have a Tommy gun that shoots fast, and a minigun that shoots faster. You have a rocket launcher that launches rockets. You have a grenade launcher which, yeah, but it can also be charged up to launch the grenades further. The laser gun quickly fires pew-pews. And finally you have the game's most iconic weapon, the cannon. As the name implies, it launches cannonballs. Big cannonballs that explode and turn most enemies into puddles of gore. The second encounter brings 3 new weapons and a couple of goodies. The chainsaw serves as a second melee weapon, dealing tons of damage over time. It's especially effective against the marsh hoppers, and would have been really handy in the first encounter. The flamethrower deals a decent amount of damage and sets enemies on fire, but has a short range. Finally, you have the sniper rifle, which is a bit strange. Unscoped, it's inaccurate and doesn't deal much damage. But while scoped, it's pinpoint accurate and for some reason deals a lot more damage, making it very effective at picking off dangerous enemies from a distance. Second encounter also adds serious bombs, which nuke every enemy nearby. Some levels also have temporary power-ups. Invincibility, serious damage and serious speed. Simple stuff, right? The depth in Serious Sam's gameplay comes from the way in which enemies interact with each other and the environment. And I think that they don't get the recognition they deserve. There are three key elements that make them stand out: the visual design, the sound design, and the behavior. The visual design of most enemies is easily discernible from one another, either because of their vivid colors or the difference in shape and size. This makes it easy to know what and where they are at a glance, which is important given that the levels have large open areas with a gazillion enemies at the same time. Sound design is forgotten all too often, but Serious Sam passes with flying cannonballs. Enemies have distinct alert and death sounds, but also ambient sounds that you can hear before even engaging them in combat. Finally, every enemy has a clear defined behavior that makes them predictable and avoidable. This might sound bad if you think about enemies individually, but Serious Sam usually doesn't throw just a single enemy against you. Serious Sam is just as much about shooting as it is about spatial awareness. Anyone can dodge a Queer's jump or biomechanoid lasers and rockets, because their patterns are so simple by themselves. The challenge is dodging everything at the same time. In my Will Rock video, I compared it to Serious Sam to demonstrate why that game's enemy design is so lackluster. And now I can use Will Rock to demonstrate why Serious Sam is so much better. Will Rock's enemies are very uniform, just launching simple projectiles or rushing towards the player, without anything to trip you up. Most of them also lack the individuality of Serious Sam's colorful roster. It's like if half the enemies were just basic rocketeers. Reptiloids and demons have projectiles that chase you around. Arachnoids have hit-scan chain guns that fire in bursts. Minor biomechanoids fire quick bursts of lasers, while majors fire slow rockets. Some of these projectiles can even be countered by shooting them. Queers throw chains or jump at you when close, but stop for a second. Wearables charge fast and launch you into the air, but have to turn themselves around. Kamikazes deal massive damage, but have low health, make their presence obvious, and can be interrupted with a quick shot. All of these move and attack differently from one another, and just when you think you're safe from one angle, another 20 will be ready to maul you from behind. Serious Sam's enemy roster excels when it's mixed together, not when it's a one-note enemy spam. This is why the large open areas with nothing in them can still provide an engaging combat experience. It's easy to simplify the gameplay and say that it's just mindlessly holding S and left mouse button, but that's a brainwave argument on the same level as all you do is press buttons. And this is why the first encounter has a couple of boring sections where the game just spams the same enemy for a while, whereas the second encounter mostly avoids this. A subtle difference between the two is that second encounter is generally more elaborate, with more environmental hazards and more varied groups of enemies. But that's not to say that the level design in first encounter is bad. Both games have very straightforward levels, but they are fun to explore and discover their secrets, ranging from basic items to all sorts of silliness. I've been playing them for nearly 20 years and there are still secrets that I haven't found. I could look them up online, but it wouldn't be the same. Even today, Serious Sam's levels are undiscovered mysteries to me. For example, take this pillar here. Inside is a secret cannon, and believe it or not, only now have I noticed it. You'd think that I would be calling myself stupid for missing it in nearly 2 decades, but all it did was put a smile on my face. Really, the colorful and silly tone as a whole brings a smile to my face with things like hippie blood. The sense of wonder that permeated every corner is also one of my favorite parts. And the way the game plays with your expectations is a big factor. I love the cheeky cunt secrets like the door at the start of Karnak. I love when I break a statue and a bunch of enemies spawn out of it. I love when I see a painfully obvious trap and jump straight into it. Serious Sam also made me paranoid as balls about discolored walls and seams between textures. Every time I see something like that, I get the urge to shoot it with explosives, and I have wasted more ammo on that than I would like to admit. It was also a technological powerhouse back then, and Croteam earned that technology test level showing off what the Serious engine could do. There's a ton of destructible props, trees vomit particles all over the place, and watching rockets and lasers illuminate surfaces blew my goddamn mind. The lens flares were kind of annoying sometimes, but god did they look amazing. And it could do giant levels and hordes of enemies without turning my PC into a nuclear engine. Technology is incredible. If you'd like to share the pain, both games are fully playable in co-op with up to 16 whole people. If you'd rather shoot your friends in the face, that's an option too. You have Frag Match, which is just your standard deathmatch, and Score Match, where picking up items and killing other people earns you score, and whoever has the biggest one wins the match. Oh, and the shotguns fire faster for some reason? Competitive multiplayer was likely not on Croteam's list of priorities, since First Encounter only has a single map. Second Encounter has a couple more, and also came packaged with Seriously Warped Deathmatch, a community-made mod that expands the selection of game modes. Of course, Serious Sam used GameSpy for its matchmaking, so yeah. Hello Darkness, my old friend. But yeah, Serious Sam is pretty cool. Now let's trash it for a bit. One thing that is a constant between both encounters is that boss battles are kinda garbage, since bosses are just giant hitboxes and the gameplay is designed around hordes of enemies. Even the final boss in Second Encounter doesn't do anything directly against you, it just spawns enemies until you shoot enough rockets up its ass. I've already mentioned those dull moments in First Encounter where the game just spams a single enemy. One other benefit of Second Encounter's improved level design is that it has less annoying secrets too. First Encounter's very first secret is a prime example, because it's miles behind your starting point. And if you didn't get the other weapons first, enjoy shooting biomechanites with your revolver for a couple of minutes. Unfortunately, Second Encounter's more elaborate design might not always be for the better. For the most part, the gimmick rooms serve as a short but entertaining diversion from the usual combat cycle, but a few just aren't very interesting and I could have done without them. It also introduces the cannon enemy, which is hard to see and shoots cannonballs at high speeds that instantly kill you out of nowhere. There's also a few wearables carrying a cannon, and those kill you instantly as well. Thankfully, there are only a handful in total, so it's not much of a problem. And I guess that Serious Sam's gameplay just isn't for everyone. While I do genuinely find it to be entertaining enough, despite how repetitive it is, not everyone agrees, and the dull moments in First Encounter don't really help. Still, I urge you to try them out if you're a fan of first-person shooters. The gameplay is as fun as ever, and the visuals might be outdated, but not any less charming than they were in the early 2000s. The games work on modern PCs, but with a few problems. I recommend turning on sharp turning on the options, but the mouse sensitivity might be a bit too high even on 0%. You can fix this by setting a very low value through the console. The sniper rifle also has a fixed FOV, which is a bit distracting if you use a custom FOV value. I also noticed a few graphical glitches in Second Encounter when I was recording a playthrough for this video. In the meantime, that seems to have been fixed somehow? But now the game refuses to run at refresh rates above 60 Hz while using OpenGL on full screen for some reason. I don't get it. In 2003, Serious Sam Gold Edition was released. This is a simple compilation of both encounters in one package. But there's something else included in it. Something sinister. For a long time, Dark Island was a mystery to me, because there's no setup for it or anything. And that's because it's just a set of custom levels made by a community member called Trisk. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on it, since supposedly it was rushed to meet a tight deadline. But to call it a mess is an understatement. Plus, the author still had time to jerk himself off. The lack of graphical polish is obvious from the start, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of downtime spent walking through flat terrain, and the enemy placement isn't very good, usually just spawning weak enemies straight ahead. The levels themselves are broken too. The boat ride, for example, stops if you don't do things exactly as it wants you to. And then there's the very last part of the episode, taking place in a rotating arena that just doesn't work properly. Look at it. Even the atmosphere has this edgy undertone that feels out of place in a serious Sam game. This whole thing is a fever-induced dream induced by the kind of substances that Croteam must have been under when they made Serious Sam 2. Except that Serious Sam 2 is a good game, and Dark Island is a bundle of garbage. There's a lot of good fan-made stuff for all kinds of games out there, but this isn't it, Chief. The README file also alludes to another set of levels that isn't included in this compilation despite saying otherwise, pointing to this being a haphazard inclusion. Oh, and it ends with a cliffhanger, because of course it does. In 2002, both encounters were ported to the Xbox, which some people see as the definitive version. I haven't touched it, but with the new Xbox mod for Second Encounter, I can see why. This is basically the Xbox version backported to the PC, with all of the updated enemy and weapon models, the modified levels, the music, the cutscenes, and the lives and combo systems. It's not finished and has a few issues, but it's mostly playable from start to finish. The levels are nearly identical to the original games, but some did get small changes to their layout, and some of them were split in two. The phone booths used for saving the game remain in place, but you can save manually like normal. The updated weapons and enemies are noticeable straight away. The single-barrel shotgun is an especially well-needed improvement, because boy, that thing has not aged well. Another good change is the inclusion of the chainsaw early in First Encounter, which is a godsend against the marsh hoppers. The life system is exactly what it says, even if they are rendered pointless given that you can save at any time. You gain lives as you score points, and every time you get wrecked, the game respawns you nearby. Killing multiple enemies in quick succession also awards you a multiplier, increasing the points earned. The console iterations also introduced a health overcharge system. Basically, you can pick up health and armor beyond the normal limits, but it will slowly come back down after a while. Perhaps not all changes are for the best, especially those that come from hardware limitations. This section here, for example, is gone. But overall, it's all around an improved version of the original games. The reason I can't 100% recommend it is that right now it's only a beta with a number of bugs. The rocket launcher and laser gun, for example, have some audio clipping, and loading safe games can sometimes result in crashes. Turning off the shadow pre-cache option helps, but doesn't completely fix it. Regardless, in 2014, Croteam gave a group of fans the green light to develop an updated version of the classics. The result is Serious Sam Classics Revolution, which is available to owners of the classics on Steam, and aims to make your life easier in this day and age. Or at least that was the idea. Revolution was a bit of a buggy mess for a while. It was practically abandoned until last year when Croteam's staff took the reins and it finally got out of beta. So what exactly do you get with Revolution? The main goal is providing a way to run the classics without any fuss on modern PCs, along with adding things like Steam Workshop support, borderless window, and fixing the sniper rifle's FOV problem. It also took inspiration from the HD remakes and added a survival mode. And credit where it's due, these survival maps are a lot more creative than the basic flat ones on the HD games. The modifiers for co-op have also been expanded, with options to tweak stuff like player speed or weapon firing rates, as well as replacing certain enemies with new ones. 3 secret weapons were also added to the campaign. The full release also came with Bright Island. Never mind the name. It's a new campaign featuring completely new levels and some new enemies. It's okay, I guess. This adventure takes place between the South America and Persia episodes. Something went wrong when Sam jumped into a teleporter and he ends up stranded in some strange gap between dimensions called Bright Island. So of course he now sets off in search of a way to find an exit back to Earth. There's all kinds of places in these levels, from giant buildings to canyons to caves. There isn't a lack of variety at least, and for the most part the environments themselves are decent if unexceptional. Unfortunately, there's a tendency for the levels to just dump a bunch of enemies all on the same place instead of spreading them out in positions that make sense. A few areas are also kind of annoying to navigate, like this hut complex full of awkward jumps and invisible walls, and I also noticed some frame rate drops that shouldn't be happening in any modern PC. But hey, it's free, and way better than Dark Island. Playing the encounters through Revolution isn't a bad choice either, it's just that it's kind of underwhelming and could be so much more. The fixes and Bright Island are nice, but it doesn't add anything of value to the classic experience, unlike the Xbox mod, which itself is unfinished and unstable. Why not add those messages telling you about the more obtuse secrets like the Xbox mod does? Why not rework the menus with better descriptions? Serious Sam is known for having a ridiculous amount of settings, but the thing is, most people have no idea what most of this does. You do get an Xbox HUD option, but even that is less complete than the one on the Xbox mod since it doesn't mark weapons without ammo. And it still has its own baggage. Changing graphics options while playing is a guaranteed crash, and for some reason there's input lag with the mouse whenever I have my controller connected. Which is weird because the controller support hasn't changed from the original encounter. Unlike the Xbox port, which had an aim assist mechanic similar to the HD remakes. And with that, we say goodbye to the classic iterations. In November of 2009, Serious Sam HD, the first encounter, was released, followed by the second encounter half a year later. In the meantime, God had died, so the games were instead published by Devolver Digital, a rather unique company formed by some fellows from Gathering of Developers. This was around the time that half the industry decided to castrate themselves by trying and failing to compete with Modern Warfare. So to see a remake of my childhood darlings with fancy modern graphics? Sign me up! The HD gameplay stays very true to the classics, and it doesn't try to reinvent itself with new enemies, weapons and levels. In fact, these really are pretty much just the original games with new graphics. And from a technical standpoint, Croteam mostly delivered once again. The shadows look so much more natural than the pitch-black stretches from the classics, and the addition of effects like reflections on water adds some extra flair. Levels like Moon Mountains are completely revitalized thanks to all the grass covering the flat ground. The new physics engine and the enhanced gore are also satisfying and gives me a reason to use anything besides hippie blood. Those blobs of red really weren't very good. First Encounter's multiplayer is more or less the same. Score match is gone, but co-op and deathmatch are still there, with 7 maps to choose from. HD Second Encounter, however, greatly expands multiplayer options, both for co-op and player versus player. It also has a new survival mode where you have to survive as long as you can. Speaking of which, you can access everything from within Second Encounter HD if you own both games, so there's no need to even launch First Encounter HD. In fact, you get a couple of quality of life improvements in it, along with Steam Workshop support. I've mostly played the HD versions since they were released. but looking back on the originals, I have reconfirmed to myself that Croteam took a technological jump and an artistic stumble. The footage you have been seeing so far isn't how the games look by default. The saturation slider is well above normal. This has bothered me for a long time, but it wasn't until recently that I realized just how hard the HD remakes dropped the artistic ball, especially in the first encounter. A lot of areas look desaturated, and their vibrant color schemes became much duller with this brownish tone all over the place. The beautiful skyboxes of levels like Valley of the Kings and Karnak have also been replaced, and not for the better. Everything just has this more gritty and less colorful and cartoony tone to it. Half the textures also remain the same, and sometimes you can see the separation between the new and the old. This was also around the time when developers were horribly mishandling bloom, making things look like glowy garbage sometimes. HD's second encounter is better about this, and its environments still lend themselves better to a more colorful style. But as shown by the original first encounter, just because your game takes place in Egypt doesn't mean everything needs to be brown and grey. In fact, some pre-release screenshots looked more colorful, and one even showed flamethrower and sniper ammo in a first encounter level. To be fair, Croteam was apparently having serious financial troubles around that time. Between Serious Sam 2 and 3, Atari hired Croteam to work on a military shooter called TEOR, but it was cancelled and some staff members were laid off. At one point, Croteam also pitched a Doom game to id Software, but as we all know, nothing came out of that until years later. But it does explain a lot about Serious Sam 3. Anyway, gameplay-wise, the HD games look identical at first glance, but something about the movement physics in the updated engine makes enemies prone to sliding all over the place, particularly in tight spaces. It's not uncommon to see queers sliding around pillars and walls. The updated physics also means that the trippy gravity effects are either gone or feel kind of awkward. Second encounter is especially hurt by this, and rooms like this rotating arena have changed from amusing distractions to middling annoyances. Then you have some arbitrary balancing changes, like the grenade launcher being faster all around, or rocket packs giving you 8 rockets instead of 5. The Tommy gun was generally inferior to the minigun, but now it's nearly obsolete. Originally both dealt the same damage with each shot, but the minigun was twice as fast. In HD, the minigun is just a bit faster, but also deals twice the damage with each shot. Oh, and lava golems can die from walking on lava. To be clear, I'm not saying that the HD versions are bad. They have more eye candy, they have Steam Workshop support, and you can access everything from a single place. It's just that I feel like something was lost in the transition, so I recommend trying the classics for yourself, if only to have a point of comparison. But regardless, the HD versions are fine, which is something I can't say about the DLC. The Legend of the Beast was launched in May of 2012 for Second Encounter HD, 2 whole years after the game's release and also half a year after Serious Sam 3. Aside from a couple of survival and versus maps, it comes with 3 single-player levels based on the old alpha. By which I mean it recycles the old maps but uses the HD assets. It doesn't have alpha weapons or enemies or anything interesting, and unfortunately it sucks harder than a secretary at the White House. It's a slog that fails to take advantage of the enemy and weapon roster at its disposal, and doesn't add anything of its own except for the final boss. And even that is just a rehash of First Encounter Zone. The first 20 minutes are spent with your revolvers shooting soldiers and arachnoids that have been scattered without any thought, which of course takes forever. Eventually you pick up a shotgun and it gets better, but there's still a lot of dull combat sections. It feels like half of it is spent fighting basic beheaded soldiers, with more dangerous enemies only showing up every once in a while. It's only near the end that it escalates to anything resembling a proper Serious Sam level, before finishing with a bootleg Hell Knight from Serious Sam 3. It's supposed to take place a bit after halfway through first encounter, but the progression is more like you're stuck in the first level for an hour. There was so much potential for an official remake of the alpha content, but all you get is a pile of dicks. It's arguably worse than the alpha, which had the decency of not forcing you to fight arachnoids with just revolvers. The only positive thing I can say about it is that it looks really nice in some places. So why in the hell am I going to recommend both HD Encounters, all of its garbage DLC, and Serious Sam 3? Because of Fusion. Serious Sam Fusion. Beta. 2017. I'm not sure why it's still called Beta 2017 when we are already in 2020, and Beta implies that the developers are still working on it. Fusion is like Revolution, but for the HD Encounters and Serious Sam 3. It runs on a newer version of the engine and comes with its own gameplay tweaks. Although the vast majority apply to 3, because if any of them desperately needed improvements, it's that pile of dicks. The good news is that Fusion can actually run smoother in CPU-intensive areas due to its support for newer APIs and higher core counts. The lighting is also a little bit more vibrant, and certain effects like bloom and reflections are improved over the standalone HD games. The bad news is that the updated engine also has a host of random problems that kind of bring it down. Ironically, it can look worse than the vanilla HD games in some places. Notably, the draw distance for certain objects is much shorter in Fusion, and some levels have this fog that washes out distant details. The movement physics also took another dive, and the simple act of platforming now feels extra floaty and awkward, more than the standalone HD versions ever did. It also makes certain sections into frustrating ordeals, like indoor clear rushes. Wearables also received a change that lets them turn around faster, making them more challenging but also breaking the balance of certain fights that were built around their original abilities. Second Encounter's wacky gimmicks are made worse too, and even after several updates the modern Serious engine still can't do things that its 19-year-old iteration could. Instead, it transforms them into a source of frustration that I dread going through. Even on normal difficulty, some of these rooms feel like they are more about luck than actual skill, and on hard and above they're just straight up bollocks. What makes Fusion worth it is the modding community. The only problem is that you need all of the content for both Encounters and Serious Sam 3 for many mods to work properly. The big one is the custom weapons management tool, which lets you replace weapons with others on a per weapon basis. Like if you want to use the BFE single barrel shotgun on the encounter levels, you can replace any weapon with it, and it will replace all of its ammo pickups as well. The real beauty is that it's not just the arsenal from the two Encounters and Serious Sam 3. There's ports of not only other Serious Sam games, but from other series, and even a lot of individual ones of all sorts. And you can mix and match everything you want. We're talking about a first-person shooter here. If anything can change the experience, it's the weapons. And having such a wide array of options at your disposal does wonders for replayability. I mean, Serious Sam's arsenal is good and works great with the gameplay, but it's not exactly elaborate or original. There's other interesting gameplay mods as well. Oh, and there's one that turns the game into Doom Eternal. And of course, there's general improvements like texture packs, models and animations, along with community-made custom levels and all that. I can recommend the Seriously Stupid HD Remaster campaign, because it leads into my final rant. It feels to me that I'm not part of Croteam's target audience anymore. I love the silly tone, the colorful visuals, and even Sam's cheesy one-liners. Yet ever since the HD remakes, the series continues moving towards a more gritty and grounded style, which is the opposite of what I wanted. I know I've been very negative about the HD remakes, but I don't hate them. I also don't hate Revolution, and I certainly don't hate Fusion either. They are completely free, completely optional additions that nobody forced the developers to do, and the world is better off with them than without them. It's just that... seriously? We have a Chenky update, an HD remake, and another Chenky update, yet none of them actually tried to bring back the changes and content from the Xbox port? Or to fix some of the glaring problems with the level design? You know, refine the gameplay in a meaningful way? Fusion is especially frustrating because I suspect that Croteam changed the inner workings of the engine to improve Serious Sam 3, but without caring about the consequences it would have on the encounters. Fusion would also be an opportunity to bring the visuals closer to the classic versions, or to add some optional bonuses like playing 3 with the classic arsenal, or to have sprinting in the encounters. You know who did these things? The modding community. Well, I guess Croteam did change things up with the VR ports, but that's a whole different can of worms. I'm sorry if I sound a bit salty about this. Maybe I'm the one who is wrong. Maybe Serious Sam only looked the way it did because of the technology available back then, and I just assumed wrong. Many people hated Serious Sam 2 but loved Serious Sam 3, so I guess Croteam is just answering the call for more. Anyway, Serious Sam 4 finally comes out this next month. I can't say I'm impressed with what has been officially shown so far, but Croteam has been quite secretive about it. They've talked about the insane amount of enemies, the open world, the weapon upgrades, the side quests and characters, but nothing concrete has been shown publicly. What is strange is that some very positive information and screenshots have only been mentioned on the official Discord channel for some reason. It's kind of weird how they've gone about it. Oh well, I guess we'll just have to see for ourselves. Just like how I saw for myself the talent and creativity of a small developer whose games I fell in love with all those years back.